Everyone, meet the fabulous Gareth Morris. This is so cool. We're going to keep this like pretty sort of easygoing, but we've got our questions lined up. But Gareth is just such a. We were talking about how science and research has changed over the past few years culturally. Should we just go on to that? Just tell us about you, what got you into your work, and what you're doing. And then we'll do the little bit of history bit, maybe.
Yeah, where to start? So I'm originally from the UK, if you can't tell from the accent. Apparently some people can't. And I'm now working over in Ireland, and I think the accents are starting to morph into one bizarre combination. I did my PhD research over at the University of Birmingham. Wow, I finished like 6-7 years ago now. After that, I moved down to London to work at University College London. And I was lucky enough to spend 4 years in Queen Square in the Institute of Neurology down there. And then, that was a fantastic time. And following on from that, I moved over to Dublin, I think just over 2 years ago now. And I'm currently working as part of what's called the Future Neuro Research Centre over here. Yeah, I guess that's kind of the whistle-stop history.
What got you into studying what you are doing now? Are you a sciencey buff? And, what got you interested in the human brain? Tell us about that.
Originally, to be honest, I actually wanted to be a medical doctor. So I remember this was a really kind of horrible moment. I'd applied to do this again in Birmingham, and I was offered the place. I had everything lined up. When it came to A-level results, I was 3 points short in chemistry. So that was, it was a tough moment, but sometimes I think these things come along maybe for a reason. So
yeah,
my backup choice, as it happened, was to study biomedical science. And in the end, I really loved it. The part that, just kind of stuck with me most naturally and that I really got on with the best was neuroscience as an undergraduate. And so as part of that course, I did I think it was like a 6-week lab placement or something over one of the summers in one of the neuroscience labs with a guy called Dr. Andy Powell, and in the lab of John Jeffries. And it was just, it was such a great experience. And I think, Andy in particular was a really important influence at the start of my career because he was just so enthusiastic and so supportive. And, I guess I was lucky to be in a really supportive environment at the start of my career. And that really just set me going, developing this passion for what I'm doing. And, it's kind of by chance that was an epilepsy research lab, if I'm honest. I remember when I started that project, I didn't really know a lot about epilepsy itself. It's kind of something you learn as you go. But yeah, I just went from there, really. That's how I got into it. Stayed in the epilepsy field, working my way through different epilepsy labs, and then still where I am today.
So this is really lovely. And, I hear quite a lot about people such as yourself. They don't purposely necessarily go into epilepsy research, but when they find it, or they're kind of slotted into epilepsy research, they're like, this is actually really interesting. And then, then you learn more about us guys, and it's like, wow, this is needed. This research really needs to be done. And I guess then you realize actually with your work, you can have a massive impact on the life of millions.
And I think that's, to be honest, we were discussing briefly before we started recording. This is something that I think we as scientists, we don't always necessarily realize or appreciate the value of our work to people like yourself and to society in general. We go into this career because we like solving problems. We want to hopefully eventually do something meaningful, but you can get really kind of bogged down in the details of what you're doing in your specific problems. And you don't always think of the bigger picture that, there are real people out there who are living with epilepsy, and they are hoping for new treatments or new breakthroughs or whatever we're working on. And I think for us as a scientific community, it's so important to hear from people like yourself that stand to benefit from what we're doing ultimately.
And even those of us whom, so we'll talk a little bit about your work in a minute, obviously, but for instance, the work that you're doing might not benefit loads of us or even the majority of people with the diagnosis. But that isn't the only thing that we care about ourselves. It's about the wider community and knowing that what you do can benefit other people too. And in fact, in addition to people with a diagnosis, it's benefiting their families and the people that love them. And as you mentioned before, society as a whole, because it's pretty expensive having epilepsy, to be honest. Expensive not just for people with diagnosis, but for society. And I think few people recognize that. Yeah, few people recognize, I think, the value of research long term, that it's actually going to save the taxpayer money. But I digress a little bit there. So, oh yes, so we're going to go on to, and this is really cool, everybody, just to warn you in advance, Epilepsy in English. Now, this is your blog, your website. I love the title. How did this come to be?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess before I explain, I'll say a little bit about what it is and what we want to do. Yeah. So Epilepsy in English, it's a website that we started over here at the Future Neuro Research Center. Initially, it was kind of a project between myself and Christina Reshka, who's another research fellow here, actually recently a lecturer now. And this really came about because we attended the science communication conference kind of workshop over here in Dublin a couple of years ago. And there was a very inspirational speaker, a guy called Mark Pollock. And you know, if you don't know about him, I think he might be a bit better known in Ireland. But his story is incredible. I hope I get this right. Early in life, he was a very talented rower and, you know, stood to be, I think, on the Olympic rowing team for Ireland. You know, he was a very elite athlete. And he, if I get this correctly, he had an accident which I think it severed his spinal cord.
Right.
And, you know, this obviously was a catastrophic life-changing event. Later on, I think separately from that, he also lost his vision. And so, you know, this guy, he's had a lot of setbacks, but he never let that get the better of him. And one of the things that was really inspirational about this guy is that he was very driven to understand the research going on into, I don't know, I guess it was like nerve regeneration. Right. In his case, you know, he wanted to understand the research that was going on into his condition and what the kind of hopes and prospects might be for the future. But one of the things he said, so bear in mind, this is an audience packed full of scientists like myself. One of the things that he said was, if you guys, you scientists, want people like myself, people that, you know, live with these conditions, if you want us to read your work and understand your work, you have to make it so that we can understand it. Yeah. Because then, I mean, by nature, when we write scientific papers, they're reader and technical. You know, they have to be so that we can send them to other scientists and people can try to reproduce what we've done, because ultimately being able to reproduce a piece of scientific work is kind of the hallmark of credibility and, you know, the cornerstone of good science. So we have to make things very specific and write in particular ways so that other people can do them. But the problem there is there's a huge number of people, I think like yourself, Tori, that want to look at what we're doing, want to understand what we're doing. But if we're using words that you've just never seen before, you know, it's no fault of your own. We basically have our own language.
You know what? It actually makes me think of, you know, when you're at school and you have to choose between, say, French and German. Yeah. I wish I could have chosen science lingo, because it is so like that. And that's why I started putting together the glossary on our website, Epilepsy Sparks, because, yeah, it just sometimes seems like a bunch of far too many syllable written words that just don't make sense. And you're exactly. Like, is this required? Really?
And you know what? I mean, even for myself as a scientist, if I try to read a scientific journal article that is outside of my field, say I try to read something about cancer, it's very hard to understand. Even as a scientist, when you go to other fields, they use different words, different lingo, and it's hard to keep track of. So really, you know, our mission, myself and Christina, from the start with this was to try to fill that gap. You know, we're both by now, I like to think, reasonably accomplished epilepsy researchers. And we kind of identified that need to communicate what we are doing and what others are doing to a broader audience, you know, to people with epilepsy, as you say, you know, to their families, to any other stakeholders within that epilepsy community. And so Epilepsy in English is like, I guess, our attempt, our piece to go towards bridging that gap. And what we try to do is we take epilepsy research articles, usually not from ourselves, usually from other labs around the world.
I love the photos you've got in it, by the way. Guys, check it out. It's so cool just seeing these tiny bits of brain sometimes. I'm like, oh my goodness. And you make it really pretty. But sorry, carry on.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, so it's as well, it's nice to share that visual aspect of research and show that, it's not all just kind of boring graphs and things,
Yeah.
So what we do, we take epilepsy research papers from other labs around the world. We try to kind of cover a variety of topics, and we basically, I wouldn't say translate them, we find ways to explain them in kind of plain English language that we hope is accessible to everybody. We hope it's easy enough to read for people that aren't necessarily experts in the subject. But at the same time, there's a delicate balance. We don't want to lose the message of what the researchers are trying to say. We don't want to kind of lose the value of the research. So we try to make things accessible, I guess, without oversimplifying them. And so, yeah, we've been doing that now for, I'd say about 18 months, I think, in total. And as I say, it started off as a project between myself and Christina. We recently changed that a little bit to broaden it out. So the website, like, I'm kind of editing it now, but we're looking for people within that. So I mentioned the Future Neuro Research Center earlier. It's a fantastic organization of all kinds of different labs and hospitals and whatever throughout Ireland. And we're trying to really leverage that to have people with different research viewpoints, different research interests, and so on to contribute. So a different person will contribute one post every month. And what we really want to do there is give a broader overview of what's going on in the epilepsy field.
Can I just say also, sorry, when you're talking about people who, we have different scientists around the world researching epilepsy and then different interpretation of data or reports. And I was actually listening to Brainwaves by Jim Siegler a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking actually about that, how you get different people reading data in different ways, and it has different meanings depending upon unconscious bias or primarily, I think. And that's really interesting. And I think, I can really relate to that actually as a patient as well, because as patients, we can see what you write, read what you put down there and interpret it in different ways. So yeah, it's really important from a scientific perspective, but also culturally and education-wise for us to see those different perspectives and interpretations of data, science and experiences and the whole lot.
Yeah. You touched there, Tora, on something that is really very important, which is unconscious biases, because, we do our best in science to avoid that kind of thing. Because, how science typically works, right, is we will come up with some kind of fantastic idea in our heads anyway that we want to test, and we will develop what we call a hypothesis, which is basically a question that we can test with a series of experiments. We will then go away and we will perform the experiments and we will see the results. And there's a real danger that we have to be wary of, where it's called confirmation bias, right? It's where you just see the results you want to see that support what you think, and you kind of dismiss the ones that don't agree with you. And you have to be very careful not to do that. You have to try to be balanced. And that's where I think discussing your experiments and your data and your ideas with a bunch of different people is so important, because they will come in with their own ideas. And, I might have my series of experiments and my series of results, and, two of my results support what I think is true, but one of them doesn't really fit. And then another scientist from a different lab might come along and say, well, we've been working on this in a slightly different way. We have a slightly different viewpoint, which actually fits all three of my things. And, you have to be open to different interpretations, as you say, and different perspectives. I think that's really important.
So are you including sort of messages like this in Epilepsy in English, or are you trying to, you're not going down that sort of rabbit hole yet?
I would say no, not at the moment. So what I think is our niche with Epilepsy in English is really just trying to explain research papers. And, myself and others that are writing these things, we don't put too much personal opinion in there, I would say. We try to, as faithfully as we can, describe how somebody else's research was performed and what they conclude from it and what that might mean for the epilepsy community. Epilepsy Research UK is doing a fantastic blog series covering those kinds of topics about, good science, reproducible science, how we do things well, and, what we might improve in the way we do things. So, if people are interested in the kind of the scientific method, I think Epilepsy Research UK's blog is doing a fantastic job of that. And it's not something I would, want to detract from in any way. I think, epilepsy in English kind of works in parallel with that.
I think, complementing each other rather than the other way around. And actually, I think that's one of, the sort of unique selling points of epilepsy in English as well, is that openness to share information. And I completely back up what you're saying about Epilepsy Research UK as well, because, I do work with them as well on the SAC, and there are some wonderful people working there, aren't there? Like people who are really, like yourself, trying to make a difference to society by finding answers for people when it comes to epilepsy. And yes, I agree. The blog that they've been sending out the past few months is so cool. And what I also notice is, like, for instance, and we do this at Epilepsy Sparks as well, is listing sources of information to back up their declarations within the blog, which is so important, just like on a paper at university, isn't it? Like, because we get blogs from all around the world, which can be wonderful, but they are kind of just very personal, which is important. But also, if somebody states, for instance, and anybody could do this, there are 20 types of epilepsy. Well, okay, what are you basing that on? I mean, we know that to be inaccurate, but we need confirmation of these statistics. So I think that's really important that Epilepsy Research UK are doing that, and the same with any sort of credible source of information.
Yeah, it's definitely something that's very important. We have to be able to back up and verify the things that we say or the claims that we make, because you don't want to spread false information or fake news, as people are so fond of saying. It's something we've discussed as well with Epilepsy Ireland, which is a fantastic epilepsy advocacy organization over here in Ireland. Obviously, we at Epilepsy in English we've been planning for a while, and we're fairly well advanced in launching some kind of formal collaboration with Epilepsy Ireland, because one of the things that they seem to be very interested in as well is this helping people to identify reliable research papers and information, and really helping people within the epilepsy community to be able to understand and to know that the information they are receiving is good. It is very important. And I think, just going back to your previous comments, one thing I wanted to say is really great about the epilepsy research field and the wider epilepsy community is that sense of community. I've never felt that people are trying to compete with each other, trying to, claim credit for X, Y, Z. You have guys like the people at Epilepsy Research UK that are doing a fantastic job of promoting epilepsy research. You have people like yourselves at Epilepsy Sparks, who are, I think what I love about Epilepsy Sparks is that it shares that really human aspect of epilepsy. It tells the story of people living with epilepsy and how it affects them, and that's an important message to get across. Then, we have Epilepsy in English, which is kind of a different niche, which is trying to make the ongoing in the future research more accessible. And as you say, all of those different cogs work together.
They complement each other, right? Because
exactly.
It's such a huge picture, epilepsy. People think it's just about seizures and take some pills and that's it. But actually, no, there are a million different aspects to it. And we need input from all of these people who experience that.
Yeah, and you know what? That's something that, to my shame, I guess, I only appreciated relatively recently from talking with people like yourself, that epilepsy is more than just seizures. And that's something that we don't always, or have not always, appreciated as scientists and researchers, because we will go away into our lab and we will have our brilliant idea that is designed to stop seizures. And, I'm sure that if I can design something that will completely stop somebody's seizures, I'm sure that is a fantastic thing for a person with epilepsy, don't get me wrong. But what I've learned through talking with people is that there are so many different, really human aspects to how it affects people. And that can really be incorporated into our work as well. And we can try to look at, aspects like mental health or like sleep disturbances,
Thank you.
like memory, that kind of thing. And, it's only by talking with people who have actually experienced epilepsy themselves, we can know that those things exist. So I mean,
Exactly. Thank you. This is just what we all want to hear. And I think I've said this to you before, but hey, I can't remember, ironically, is how lots of us would prefer to, well, I can speak personally, I would rather have a seizure every day if it meant that my mental health was more stable and that I, didn't have to experience the other things, the psychiatric issues. And it's, or I didn't have to. And another thing, like you're saying, side effects of anti-epileptic drugs, they are, to be frank and very polite, pants for many of us. Some people are all right, they can cope with it, but a lot of us, it's really, really awful. And people have days where they're like, what, sod it, I'm just not going to take my drugs because I'm so annoyed with it. And I've done that before as well. Stop taking my drugs, big mistake. But, it's what you do when you're younger. And then you learn, okay, that wasn't worth it. And you have to come to the conclusion that I have to give up part of me, my life, at the moment at least, because we don't yet have enough research and into, better treatment or even preventions. I have to give up that part of who I feel that I am so that I don't have seizures all the time.
Yeah.
That's tough, but what we have is people like you and other organizations, especially those like Epilepsy Research UK and Future Neuro, just saying, do you know what, we get it, mate, and we're listening to you, and this will help us redirect, if necessary, our research so that we can more effectively actually help people with epilepsy.
Yeah. And, those stories, obviously yourself, Tori, you're very open to sharing these experiences. And those stories are so very human and so hard hitting, I would say, and things we don't realize. And to give you an example, so in the Future Neuro Research Center here, we're quite big and on engagement with the public, with people with epilepsy and with other neurological diseases. And what we've tried to do, and it is challenging, don't get me wrong, but what we've tried to do is take on board the things that we hear from you guys and at least begin to think about and incorporate that in our research. And so, I mean, I can give you an example. We published a research paper in, I can't remember when it finally came out, but, earlier this year. And we had discovered 3, what we think quite exciting and promising new treatments for temporal lobe epilepsy. And, we have very good evidence that all 3 of these molecules can stop seizures or reduce them almost entirely. But having spoken with people like yourself and with other people with epilepsy, we kind of understood that, great, we can stop seizures, but we can try to do more. And so we started, alongside looking at the seizures, because, that's still very important. We also looked at the impact on things like memory, which is something we can assess in the lab. It's something that we can do. And, we just weren't doing before. And so within that piece of work that we published and within things that we are doing now to this day, we look not only do we look at the effect of our experimental compound, whatever, on stopping seizures, we also look how it can impact on things like memory and behavior and so on and so on. And that's something that's come directly from this kind of conversation, I think. And it's something that, we as researchers are becoming more open to and should continue to do so.
Thank you. That's really, really encouraging. Oh, yeah. I wanted to ask you this because I think that this is rarely touched, and many of us, if not the majority of us, patients and carers and stuff, aware of. How do you actually fund your research?
Yeah.
Be blunt. Tell us what a struggle it is.
Sure. I'll try to describe it as well as I can. So typically what happens, let's say when you start your PhD, now you can pay for your PhD yourself if you are lucky enough to be able to afford it. For most people, that would be very expensive. So typically your PhD, what will happen is some big professor somewhere has applied for a research project and they will advertise for a student and for a fully funded PhD studentship. And so they will have applied to something. So for example, my PhD was funded by Epilepsy Research UK, one of the many reasons I'm a big fan. And so yeah, my professor had applied for that money. They advertised for a student, so I didn't have to do anything, other than apply for the PhD and convince them that I'm
pretty competitive, though, isn't it? Getting those PhD positions.
Yeah, so that's tricky in the first place, but you're applying, I guess, to the professor and the university rather than to a funding body. The challenge, so the kind of career stage I'm at, I guess, is like somewhere between what we call early and intermediate career fellowships. And that's where I start to have to take a little bit more responsibility myself for getting my own salary. And basically how that works is there will be a series of kind of scientific funding bodies. So things like the big ones would be Medical Research Council, Wellcome Trust. You will have people like Epilepsy Research UK who are disease specific, and they're up for various conditions. There are different charities. And essentially, they will have what's called a funding call or a funding round, and they will basically advertise a series of schemes. And you go through and you see like what scheme you are eligible for at your specific career stage or experience level or whatever. And you have to apply for it. You have to compete for it. So you have to typically send in your CV with a list of your research achievements. You have to write a research proposal for what you want to do and how you are the best person to achieve that, and how you also have to find a host institution, so usually a university, and you have to persuade that university and a person within it to give you like the lab space to do what you want to do. And then you have to put this all together into one big grant proposal. You send it in, and then that will get reviewed by a bunch of experts within the field, and the funding body will, they obviously can't fund everything, because one of the issues, especially in epilepsy research, is that funding is relatively limited.
It's awful. I openly say that it's absolutely awful. It's quite frankly disgusting when you consider how many of us are affected by it, and you compare that. There was a publication released to all, I think, members, and it's also on the website of Epilepsy Research UK. And you compare the research per patient for people with epilepsy compared to those with, I don't know if it was Alzheimer's or something, and it's quite frankly horrific. It's our interpretation of that is that, for many of us, that people with epilepsy aren't valued as much. And that's something which, has to change. And that's what really made me think about when you guys have to try and apply for funding, whether, positions, first of all, PhD and stuff like that. But then, I've spoken to lots of people, professors, who have to spend a significant amount of time writing applications for funding. Otherwise, labs can literally shut down.
I think that it's true that, a lot of the very senior people, they spend a significant amount of their time writing grants, which will ultimately possibly not be successful,
And how nuts is that?
As people, one thing that I'm experiencing myself now is that as you get slightly more senior, you as I say, have to take more responsibility to generate your own research funding. And you spend more and more time on a computer writing things rather than in a lab directly researching things. And, we do, have a fantastic team of PhD students around us that do typically focus more on lab work. But it's not great, I would say, if your senior professors and whatever are so bogged down in writing what is sometimes very, very long applications.
Pages and pages, right? Pages and pages.
Yeah.
And I know that some universities, they will, for instance, have entire departments just writing applications for grants. They have to have people employed full time just to apply for grants. Now, that is crazy. And I never realized that one. Well, it's only the past for like a couple of years talking to people like yourself that I've actually gotten to know. We have you guys put in, so much time, effort, blood, sweat, and tears continuously, because it doesn't end at uni, to do the work that you want to do and try and achieve basically better quality of life for people affected by epilepsy. And then you have to invest your time, energy, blood, sweat, and tears into applying for grants. And you compare that to somebody who might sort of have, if there is such a thing, bog standard 9-to-5 job, you go into work and you come out of work, and that's it. You apply, that can be a real palaver as well, but there isn't any of that other application for funding, otherwise your job might end type thing.
And that's another really important point to make, and I won't obviously name any names, but you hear stories of really, really excellent research scientists who move out of the research field because either they just don't want to continue being in that relatively insecure environment of applying for funding every few years and fearing losing your job, or they actually do lose their job because they don't, for whatever reason, get the funding at that time. And you see great people that move into, related things still, but not directly doing epilepsy research because they simply don't get the funding one time and they lose their job. That is criminal, really.
Right. Because it's like everything in life, and I said it a million times, and as cheesy as it is, without education of people like yourself, we don't have research. But we need, first of all, funding for that education, such as your PhD. Then we need funding for the lab. We need funding for your research assistants. We need funding for all of that stuff. And I think what few people seem to recognize is that it's not just because, say you get £1 million, that would be great, fund in addition to what you already have for your current research. People aren't going to see results necessarily, probably very quickly, right? We've got to wait. It's a long-term thing. What's just come to mind is, like, for instance, the development of the 747 or A380 Airbus. It took years and years and years to construct these things and figure out if they were viable or not. And it's very similar, I think, in science and medicine.
Of course, because for example, those new treatments I described earlier that we published the results of this year, for those compounds to actually really make a difference to people, you have to go through a whole series of safety testing, of course, clinical trials, and these things are all, they take a long time and they're very expensive.
Yeah.
And that is another challenge. But, it goes back to what you were saying. These particular compounds I'm talking about, we started working on them or trying to identify them maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And it's taken that amount of time to generate sufficient evidence to be able to confidently and robustly say these molecules can stop seizures and not have horrible effects on learning and memory or something.
Yeah.
And that's because we have to go through things carefully and methodically, that's
safely.
It is a lengthy process. Yeah. And then, we're kind of, I guess, roughly halfway down that line from the initial idea to the end benefit to society of being able to hopefully one day give this to people. And so, like you say, what was funded 5 years ago now may not show an obvious benefit to society for another 5 years yet. And so there is that delay in what you see. And so that, again, is where something like Epilepsy in English comes in, that it's very important to show what we are doing, what is ongoing, what are the future prospects. We're not there yet to the clinic, but we are halfway along, kind of thing.
And also, I think it's important for you guys to know that what you think might be a bit boring, us lot can find it really interesting, as long as you translate it, of course, into English. Yeah. And also, we're all so busy today, even though most of us stuck at home. We need some intellectual stimulation, and we need some hope And also lots of us will forget what you posted last week anyway. So you can just tell us again and that's fine, So it's really important to have easy access to understandable information, such as what you're writing on epilepsy in English. Yeah. So, all right, cool. We've been pestering for ages. So tell me about what you get from your work. What keeps you going day to day? Like everyone has really rubbish days or rubbish times. And I know for lots of us at the moment, this is a really challenging time. But, tell us what keeps you going, because it's not the best paid job in the world. It's, what's great about it and why do you do this for us?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a part of it is, a lot of the people in this kind of work really love solving problems, love coming up with new ideas and interesting solutions to try to solve a biological problem, essentially. It's obviously a little bit cliche, but it's true that the motivation to try to make a difference to people's lives, to hopefully discover something that one day will be very valuable to people in society, is a big motivation. And I think one of the things that I really love about what I'm doing now is, there's a nice variety in what I'm doing, that you do, one sort of experiment one day, you might do something different the next. And there's a lot of autonomy to go between those ideas and figure out how best you want to solve the problems. I think it's kind of nice. It's kind of like being a detective almost, that you identify this problem and then you go around trying to work on it until you make some breakthrough,
And do you know what you're making me think of? Is I've had people, and this just still sounds weird to me, but Tori, you've got an arty side, and I'm like, no, really, and it makes me think of you and your colleagues, because I think what few people realise is that to make, in my opinion anyway, a good scientist, you have to have that creative side and almost like a childlike way of thinking. There is no such thing as a stupid question. And you kind of like, it's awful sort of saying, but, think outside the box, or, maybe this, what about this? This could work. Maybe it won't. But also, and then the conversation between you and your team or somebody that you trust, just saying, what do you think about this? And mate, what on earth? And that can actually be a good sign, because maybe nobody else is doing it. Let's try this. So yeah, I think that creativity is, we have the stereotype of scientists. You guys are all like really boring with dodgy white coats, and you also
that's true.
Dodgy as anything hair, and you love yourselves and you don't talk to us a lot because we are less of that. And it's just, it couldn't be further from the truth, at least today.
Yeah. And I think, those kind of stereotypes probably are not without some basis, but I don't think they really hold true for anybody that I've ever met, really.
Same
in this field. I was going to say something really insightful then, and I forgot what it was.
Great. You make me feel not so silly with my memory.
No, it happens all the time.
So they'll probably come back afterwards. Well, we're going to do a podcast anyway, aren't we? So maybe we'll come back to you then. So I don't know, like any sort of like cheesy note at the end you want to give people. I don't know, like
go and check out Epilepsy in English.
There you go.
No, I guess one of the messages that I really support that Epilepsy in English is supposed to be a small part of is really trying to encourage and facilitate and normalize that dialogue between research scientists, between people with epilepsy, and between clinicians as well. A very important part of this picture that we've not spoken about today, because all of those people, and then also families, advocacy groups for epilepsy, and so on and so forth, all of these people have differing viewpoints, and they're all very important. And I think obviously epilepsy is a hugely complicated condition, and we have to really piece together all of those different viewpoints to make progress with this.
Do you know what? And this is going to sound a bit political, or some people won't like it, but I do think that from the perspective of patients and families, carers and stuff, there is still, it's almost like you have organisations that compete with each other. And which can be a good thing, but it can be a troubling thing as well. And in addition to that, we don't yet all have access to up-to-date information, or we don't know where to get it from. And this brings me back to my sort of cheesy comment about education being key. If people like myself and carers and stuff, don't actually have any knowledge of the existence of the most recent reports, papers, and results, then we are going to have differing opinions. So I think it's really, really important for us lot to be kind of ensure we're singing from the same hymn sheet. Because if somebody agrees with another person, but they are not basing that on the same data, empirical evidence, then that's not very useful.
Yeah.
But yeah, I know you can't really comment on that because it's not very PC, but it's true, it's true. And I think but by having more available data and consistency and availability of that, we can be of better use to you as well.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to this point of helping people to identify trustworthy and reliable research, right? Because it could well be that, somebody may well have read a published research paper, which would be a load of garbage, and they might have seen this is in what sounds like a good scientific journal. It might all sound very legitimate and very reasonable, and then they might take that as fact. Whereas I guess kind of maybe the privilege of being active in the epilepsy research field is you see a lot of excellent work and you know a lot of people who are doing it, you know the reputable journals, and you can also recognize maybe things that aren't so good, and you can hopefully amplify the messages of things that seem trustworthy and maybe not the other ones,
Yes. Yeah. Well, I personally think that we all need to, like you have been saying both openly and perhaps even subconsciously, that I think we all need to work together more and be open about these things and be open to being questioned. It doesn't mean that somebody distrusts you. It doesn't mean that they don't like you. It's just asking a question. We shouldn't be afraid to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And none of us knows everything.
Right.
None of us is correct all the time.
The more you learn, the more you realise you don't know.
Exactly.
So, anyway, Brill. Well, if anybody wants to contact you, well, of course, they should go to your website, URL being epilepsyininenglish.ie. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Great. Please check that out, everyone. Also, we have a wonderful guest blog from Gareth on epilepsysparks.com/blog. What if anybody wants to contact you, whether they be patient, fellow scientist, researcher? What should they do?
I think Twitter is a great platform for this kind of thing. Like, I'd say that Twitter is one of the ways, possibly how I came across you and Epilepsy Sparks. I can't remember exactly, but it's a great way for people to share what they have to say to interested people. So my personal Twitter is Gareth Morris 5. Epilepsy in English has its own account, which is at epilepsy_en.
Yeah.
So there's also links to that from the main website and things like that. And then finally, I'd encourage people to also check out the Future Neuro Research Center here. So, this is a huge undertaking throughout Ireland. And one thing we're very interested to hear from the epilepsy community and hear people's points of view. You can check out now. I'm going to have to just open up our website here to make sure I give you the right link and don't get murdered by anybody. Certainly you can just Google Future Neuro. So the website is www.futureneurocenter.ie, or you can also find us on Twitter if you just search for Future Neuro. And we're based in Ireland, but we would love to hear from people from around the world. And that's one of the fantastic things with something like Twitter and the use of
it. It is brilliant. I do find Twitter actually a great place for patients to have better communication or reach out to people like yourselves. There's more sort of, I think, academic people on Twitter. And even if you don't want to sort of communicate directly, we can just follow you and see what you write.
The information is there if you want to see it, and if you want to participate, the conversation is always there. So I'd encourage people to, if they want to, you can contact me via Twitter. Even better is to contact something like Future Neuro as an organization, because there's far more people and knowledge.
Do you know what, Future Neuro, I felt really quite ashamed when you got in touch with me and I realised, oh my goodness, like Ireland is literally just a few miles away. And I just had no idea about Future Neuro and the amazing stuff that you guys are doing. And
yeah, we're relatively, well, I say relatively new. We've been going for a few years now. But it's as you say, you know, there's that delay between starting things and having something to show for it. So, you know, quite recently we've been spitting out quite a few nice pieces of research, I'd say. And hopefully we'll continue to do so.
Join that distribution list. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Also, Gareth and I are just about to record his podcast for Epilepsy Sparks Insights, so that will be available to you as well. Don't forget Gareth's blog on epilepsysparks.com/blog, and of course, epilepsyinenglish.ie. Thanks for listening, everybody.